It is a, excuse me, it is a particular pleasure and honor for me today to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Patrick Leahy from the great state of Vermont. It's a particular pleasure because I consider Pat Leahy to be a good friend. And yes, for all of you out there who are doubting Thomases, it is possible for Republicans and Democrats to be friends in Washington today. Didn't say it was easy, I just said it is possible. But it's a special honor to introduce Senator Leahy because he is a real, honest-to-goodness champion of the cause I think that brings all of us here today, and that is human rights for everyone, everywhere. In fact, I think without reservation, and I suspect everybody in this room will agree, that there is no greater champion for human rights in the U.S. Congress than our friend Pat Leahy. His determined, indeed his historic and heroic work to advance human rights is frankly too extensive for me to sit here in detail and give him a chance to talk also. But I will talk a little bit about two or three of his large people publicly aware accomplishments. However, before I do that, I want to mention that I've had an opportunity at a personal level to see his work up close. And as Senator Leahy knows, the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate has to keep an eye on these guys. So I've observed him up close, and I can tell you as Commissioner of the INS, if you choose to ignore Pat Leahy on an immigration issue, you do it at your own peril. I can tell you that Senator Leahy does a lot of things that are below the radar screen that make a big difference in the lives of a lot of people who would otherwise fall through the cracks. He is not a show horse, he is a workhorse. Pat Leahy has been a longtime leader in the international campaign against landmines. In fact, in 1992, he authored the first bill of any government anywhere to ban the export of these very horrible weapons. And in fact, he spearheaded the effort in Congress to aid victims of landmines by creating a special fund known as the Leahy War Victims Fund. And that fund has now, on an annual basis, provides about $12 million of aid to the victims of these horrible bombs. In 1997, Senator Leahy sponsored historic legislation appropriately known as the Leahy Law, which prohibits the U.S. Department of State and Department of Defense from providing military aid to foreign military and police forces that engage and violate human rights. And he never stops leading on an issue central to our mission at Human Rights First, and that's refugee protection. He is the chief sponsor of the Refugee Protection Act, which would eliminate useless hurdles that prevent persecuted refugees from receiving safe haven. At Human Rights First, we've also teamed up with Senator Leahy to fight for counterterrorism counterterrorism policies that respect human rights. In fact, in 2009, he called for the creation of an independent commission to investigate our own government's use of torture in the post-9/11 era. Unfortunately, that hasn't come to pass yet. Senator Leahy has a strong record of success because he is both a determined pragmatist and an idealist who's less interested in making a statement than in making change. And frankly, he's willing and able to work with Republicans on human rights and a whole bunch of other issues. For example, he and Senator Rubio are in the process right now of trying to get the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I want to close by sharing a little secret with you. Pat Leahy is now the longest-serving U.S. Senator, and he is President Pro Tem of the Senate. However, don't tell him that, because he thinks, and I think all of us in this room know that it's true, that he is just getting started. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Patrick Leahy. Thank you. Jim, thank you all. Thank you all. Jim, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful and not totally deserved introduction, but I'll accept it. And Jim Ziegler is one of the finest public servants I've known in either party. And when I told him as we came in here, when he was Sergeant at Arms at the Senate, he set the gold standard for everybody else to follow after that, and doing it for the best interest of the Senate, not in a partisan way, but what was best for the Senate. And Lisa, it's always great to see you. We get a chance to get caught up not only in our connections to Vermont, but what most people don't realize with a name like Patrick Leahy, my mother was first generation Italian American, and so we compare where some of our relatives are from. And of course, human rights staff and the board members who made all of this possible. I think that what you're doing is so important. In some ways, we preach to the converted here, but I've long been an admirer of human rights first, and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights before that. And what you do every day helps all of us. Your research and advocacy has certainly been extremely important in some of the legislation that I've tried to pass. So let me talk on a few topics. And partly is encouraging you, don't stop. Keep doing what you're doing. It may seem obvious that this is a central purpose of the summit, but it needs to be said. We're here because each of us feels a responsibility to defend the fundamental freedoms and principles that define our humanity and that we regard as universal, but which are often violated or denied by the very governments whose responsibility it is to protect them. Now, we know that in the history of the United States, we've seen groundbreaking human rights leadership, and we've also seen some tragic failures. Certainly the Bill of Rights, what a monumental achievement. It inspired the Universal Declaration and the freedoms that we find even enshrined today in many countries' constitutions. But the more recent advances we've seen in support of the rights of people with disabilities, women, the LGBT community, immigrants, these are examples of what we can accomplish if we persevere against what is often long-standing prejudices. I'm encouraged by our recent efforts in Congress to further support those who need our help with the improvements we've made to the Violence Against Women Act, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and at least what we've accomplished so far in the Senate in a comprehensive immigration reform. And I might say, in the area talking about the Senate, I'm so pleased that you're going to be honoring my friend Bob Dole this evening. I was there during the time when Bob was the Republican leader in the Senate, a man of integrity, and his leadership and passage of the American with Disabilities Act more than 2 decades ago. This would not have happened without Senator Dole's leadership. It was a great milestone in our human rights history. And his tireless efforts to see the United States ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities deserves our gratitude and praise. Frankly, if we had more leaders like Senator Dole, leaders who are willing to put aside any kind of petty political differences as they try to find common ground for the best of the nation, well, then we'd all be better off. And frankly, I miss leaders like that in both the Senate and the House. But while we're complimenting ourselves, let's not forget a lot of examples where the United States fell short of the ideals we saw in our Declaration of Independence. The internment of Japanese citizens during World War II,
That is really something that besmirches our history. Or the segregation laws that were upheld for years by our own U.S. Supreme Court. Or the fact we've been unable to close Guantanamo or to end mass incarceration. These are not the bright lights of our history. In fact, few days go by and we're not confronted by significant challenges to our standing as the global leader on human rights. And some of these challenges are due to external forces, and I acknowledge that, but some unfortunately due to our own doing and our own mistakes. In 1997, I wrote what became known as the Leahy Law. Now, at that time, I had no idea what impact it might have. Tim Reeser, who's here with me today, tried to explain. I thought, we'll see. He was right. I did know that we should no longer provide training and equipment to foreign security forces that abuse and murder innocent civilians. You would think this is something that we could easily all agree upon as Americans. It had happened many times where we had given aid to a country. They used that aid to murder and torture their own citizens. That was wrong. It contradicted everything this country stands for. But it also undermined our standing as a global defender of human rights when people could say, look what your aid is doing in this country. So under the Leahy Law, which would cut off that aid, is perhaps the most effective tool we have for drawing a clear line between the United States and those who commit atrocities, but also for providing an incentive for foreign governments to hold abusive military and police officers accountable. But while it's been the law for a decade and a half, some officials in our embassies have not enforced it rigorously. And I'd call on our State Department to explain the Leahy Law is the Leahy Law is the Leahy Law. And it has to apply in every country where we give aid or it is turning our back on American ideals. Let's start enforcing it everywhere. And here we go. And don't give me the excuse that somehow we're going to make it better if we keep giving the aid to the people using it to torture. No, that violates everything that we stand for as Americans. If you're going to implement the Leahy Law, you have to have the active, sustained participation and vigilance of civil society here and around the world and everybody in this room. You know, we should feel just as strongly about defending human rights activists, whether they're in Egypt or Russia, Sri Lanka, China, Vietnam, or any other country, who are persecuted for peaceful expression or association, or their religious beliefs. These are rights that we Americans take for granted. They're rights in which we take great pride. But we shouldn't hesitate to speak up when those rights are violated anywhere, our country or anywhere else. Now, I've met some activists, as many of you have, who've been subjected to brutality, isolation, torture. And I got to tell you, I'm awed by their courage. I'm awed by their unbreakable spirit. And I'm awed by the fact they never give up. We have a responsibility to support them. When they're in prison, this is something Democrats and Republicans set aside party labels, join together, and then work for their release. And here at home, we've yet to fully recover from the effects of the 9/11 attacks. We continue to mourn the horrific losses of innocent lives on that day. We do remain vigilant against the threat of future attacks. But as Americans, we should not ignore the damage done by some of the ill-conceived practices and policies put in place after 9/11. Before 9/11, I doubt if any of us could have imagined that torture, something members of Congress in both parties have condemned when used by repressive governments, would be defended by top U.S. officials as a legitimate practice in the 21st century. We must never again allow torture by our country to be cloaked in euphemisms like enhance interrogation techniques or justified by twisted and flawed legal analyses that goes totally contrary to the moral core of our country. And we should put an end to the indefinite detention of suspected enemy combatants and the use of flawed military commissions in an open-ended, ill-defined global war on terrorism. We have spoken out so many times about indeterminate detention in other countries. How can we justify it in our own? Frankly, there is no justification. I feel, and I've said this to various presidents, that the indefinite detention of prisoners at Guantanamo has contradicted our most basic principles of justice. It's degraded our international standing as a champion of human rights, and rather than helping our national security, it's actually harmed it. Countries that respect the rule of law and human rights do not lock away prisoners indefinitely without trial and without charge. We condemn those countries that do it. We should not authorize it in our own country. So I'm heartened by the incremental, this much, positive changes this year's Senate's version of the Defense Authorization Bill. We have to do more to ensure that Guantanamo is closed. And I greatly appreciate Human Rights First advocacy to close Guantanamo. Let's remove this blight. Let's remove this blight. And continue your work on the question of drones. I think drones can be used in an armed conflict, but only in accordance with international humanitarian laws. The United States for years conducted lethal operations using drones in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, some of which have killed or wounded innocent civilians and inflamed the population. And I remain very concerned about the lack of transparency surrounding these operations and the alleged use of signature strikes. They raise a very serious question whether drones comply with the international humanitarian law that we've joined in. And if you continue this precedent for the rest of the world, including other countries that have terrible human rights records, then we ought to be as transparent as possible about them and whether they are used following international laws. In fact, I would suggest here today that maybe it's time to look again at international law in this area. And maybe it's time to have some tightening of it and some changes in it. I, for one, would like to see that. So, you know, I never hesitate to criticize foreign governments that allow heinous crimes to go unpunished or that punish peaceful expression and other fundamental rights. So, too, I've criticized my own government when it fails to live up to the standards we demand of others and what others expect of us. Let me use one area. I think of the international treaty banning landmines. And I think of the continuing trend of innocent civilians becoming victims of war because the vast majority of people who are harmed, injured, killed by landmines are not combatants. They're innocent civilians, children, parents, others. There is a landmine treaty to ban the use. Every single NATO country, save one, has signed it. And that one, the most powerful nation on earth, the United States. That's not the leadership I expect of my government. The Clinton, the George W. Bush, and the Obama administration have not joined. And in not joining, they've isolated the United States on this issue. And I ask, what kind of message does this send the rest of the world in this lack of leadership? We ought to just sign it. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars removing landmines around the world. We use the Leahy War Victims Fund to help help landmine victims around the world. What are we afraid of? Why we have another Leahy law that says we cannot export landmines. Let's show the courage, it only takes a little bit, to go forward and sign the treaty like every one of our allies has done. Is that so difficult? Now, in conclusion, let me tell you, on November 22nd, we remembered the great loss this country suffered 50 years ago when President Kennedy was assassinated. As I drove down here, I remembered my wife and I, as a young law student, standing right out here in this corner, watching the cortege go by, hundreds of thousands of people on this street. It was so silent you could hear the drums when the cortege left the White House that far away. You could actually hear the click in the streetlights as they changed. And you could hear the horses and the drums as they came up Pennsylvania Avenue. And I've been thinking about that a lot in the last few days. Marcel and I have talked about it a lot and what it felt like as two youngsters standing there. And I thought of one of the many markers President Kennedy set for us in his memorable inaugural address. He spoke of the unwillingness to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today and around the world. That's what John Kennedy said in that inaugural address. Well, it's 53 years since then. I believe his words are even more relevant today. I'd argue that among the most important things we can do for our country, as he asked us to do back then, is to continue to reaffirm and uphold that commitment. And in doing so, we help the rest of the world. Frankly, the American people expect no less. My children and grandchildren expect no less. So keep on working on this, and I'll be there to fight with you. Thank you very, very much.